Welcome to lecture number 5. This will be the final main lecture in my post-labor economics series. Of course, there will be updates later on and supplementary material as the framework develops and everything comes together. However, let's jump right in today. This is bridging the gap, or how do we get there from here, or from here to there, however you want to say it. So the biggest question on everyone's mind is, okay, great. You've convinced us that we have to switch to a property-based future because wages are going away and we don't want to rely on government transfers. So what are we trying to build? So after doing a little bit of workshopping and looking at all the feedback, I put together a very simple graphic about kind of where your composite household income is going to come from. So at the very base, now this is interesting because don't let the size necessarily kind of indicate how much. It could go this way, but it's more like the foundation. So the foundation would be universal basic income, which is a combination of state, federal, possibly municipal. There are some cities trialing UBI. Not every city or county is going to be able to afford that. Only the richer counties and cities will be able to afford that. There's also talks about a global UBI, which I'm going to investigate in a future video. I personally, right now, don't think that a global UBI is possible. It might not even be desirable, but I'm going to give it a fair shake and see what I come up with. Anyways, so at the very minimum, we could have a state and federal universal basic income ranging from a couple $100s a month to a couple $1,000s a month. Above that, after implementing UBI, because that's the easiest to implement, it's the quickest, we've already done stimulus checks, we know how to do it. Next would be public wealth fund dividends. So this is a dividend-based future. So this would be done at the municipal, state, and federal level. And by the way, there's plenty of places that already do this. There are trusts, there are royalties, there are mineral rights. So the Alaska Permanent Fund is one of the biggest, most successful ones. It only pays the equivalent of a couple $100s a month, though. However, it adds up, particularly when you have multiple sources of these kinds of incomes. So municipal, state, federal. At the federal level, you can do stuff like spectrum auctions. At the state level, you can do mineral rights and right-of-way. And at the municipal level, you can do things like solar farms and that sort of thing. So these would be goods that are owned by the state. So this is technically, by definition, socialism. But as you can see, we're not trying to rely entirely on socialism. And also we're not inventing the wheel. We're not saying put all assets under, the government. This is just a few assets that make sense to manage under government resources. There's hundreds of examples out there of cities, counties, states, and federal governments running wealth funds of various kinds, whether they're funds, trusts, endowments, those sorts of things. Next above that is collectively owned private assets. So this is stuff would be like your credit union, stuff that goes through that, through cooperatives, through banks. It could also be DAOs. I know a lot of people have said well, what about cryptocurrency? What I'm going to say is Bitcoin does not fix this alone. Bitcoin is a currency, and DAOs alone may or may not fix this. But the point is that this is where privately held assets that are collectively owned, whether it's through your bank, through a DAO, or whatever, I don't really care. But that comes at this level. And so the difference is these two are the only ones run by the state. This one, it needs to be enabled by the state through regulatory overhaul, basically allowing DAOs to be a legal entity, that sort of thing. And one of the biggest problems is some people, the whole ethos behind DAOs and stuff is like, just get rid of the government. It's like, but without legal enforcement, like, adoption is going to be low. It's that simple. Next is personally accumulated assets. So this is stocks, bonds, rental properties, those sorts of things. This doesn't really change. And then finally is residual wages. So residual wages is, in the long run, people will probably still find some work. Some people will be out of work entirely. But most people, I don't know about most, but many people will still find, gig work and those sorts of things. Around, like, if you're an influencer or something and you get some ad revenue, those sorts of things. Technically, if it's a channel you own, that would be a personal asset, but you're still putting work in. Like, my YouTube channel is not passive income. I have to actively put work in. So it's technically a business, technically work, whatever. Anyways, so this is the pyramid of post-labor economics of what we're building. So you might say, okay, what's that actually look like? So this one's a little bit bunched up, but let's just say in 2029, after the next presidential election, we implement a UBI. It's $300 a month right off the bat, UBI. So this is what it might look like. If you've got a job that pays about $30,000 a year, so this is like minimum, right? That's still like poverty wages right now. So let's just assume that someone in the year 2029 is starting with $30,000 a year, and they have some UBI, and then two very narrow slices of a public wealth fund and a collectively owned private assets that they've got some investments in, and then maybe some personally accumulated assets paying a couple $100s a month, whether that is a rental property or something like that. Obviously, if you're only making $30,000 a year, you probably haven't invested in rental properties. But just for the sake of argument, this is how your income sources might look on day one. Now, about 5 or 6 years later, this is how we might expect it to look, how we might want it to look. So in this case, we've assumed that UBI might go up to $1,000 a month. Your wages will continue to go down, so they're down to $20,000. $20,000 a year, $12,000 a year. But then public wealth fund dividends will have started rising because all the various wealth trusts and endowment funds have been growing. You'll also have had more time to invest in collectively owned private assets and personally accumulated assets. So again, just a completely hypothetical portfolio. And then finally, by the time we get to 2040, we might expect UBI to be at the range of about $3,000 a month. Now, again, this could be a combination of municipal, state, and federal. So $3,000 a month, which would total $36,000 a year. Public wealth fund dividends up to $25,000 a year. Collectively owned private assets $15,000 a year. Personally accumulated assets $15,000 a year, and then maybe a little bit of work left. Now, what you'll notice is that this portfolio gets you up to $100,000 a year almost. Whereas before it was $41,000, and before that it was $37,000. So we've got a lot of work to do to do this. However, this is not outside the realm of possibilities. All right, so now that you've seen the data, let's talk about the actual, okay, what happens, how do we get there, and so on and so forth. First and foremost is the history of crisis, crash, and reform. I missed the R there. It's supposed to be crisis, crash, reform, or crisis. Maybe it's cash reform. Anyways, big unemployment shocks follow a repeatable arc: panic, cash relief, then a lasting social program inside of about 18 months. The 1935, 1958, and 2009 crises show that once joblessness tops 10%, Congress locks in a durable transfer. So durable transfer is just like some kind of structural change. So 1935 Depression-era unemployment shot up to over 20%. Granted, it was only at 24% for a month or two, but it still stayed above 14% for almost 2 full years, I believe. And it was above 10% for much longer than that. So it moved from emergency relief to a new Social Security program within 18 months. Basically, once unemployment gets that high, there's enough political willpower and motivation to say, hey, we need a structural change. Next is the 1958, a post-war recession pushed joblessness past 10%, spurred the Extended Unemployment Insurance Act, and soon after the Area Redevelopment Act. So again, once things get painful, Congress acts, and the threshold seems to be about 10%. 10 to 14%, as long as it gets there and stays there for any length of time, you see structural changes. We even saw that with the pandemic, or very early in the pandemic, unemployment spiked well above 14%, and that's when we got the stimulus checks. So we don't need, for post-labor economics to be implemented, the long story short is we don't need to see 20% unemployment or 50% unemployment. Congress will sit up and start taking notice once we hit 10% or 14%. For any length of time. Now, if we're right, then we're going to see that number creep up, as well as we're going to see other numbers creep down, such as total labor force participation rate, the number of NEETs, and those sorts of things. And as some of you have pointed out in the comments, we've even changed the way that we measure unemployment. I think it was in the 80s or 90s. And so the true unemployment rate, which there's plenty of people talking about how do you measure the true unemployment rate, because that doesn't account for underemployment. When you add in underemployment and loosely attached workers, the current unemployment rate is like 15% or something like that. It's probably higher than that by now. Anyways, point being though is that once things get painful enough, Congress will act. There is a durable history that Congress will act. And so the first thing is a cash transfer, which would be UBI, as long as it stays there. And when I say stays there, what I mean is as long as unemployment stays that high. Next is the policy response ladder. Policymakers climb a familiar three-rung ladder: monetary, fiscal, then structural. As each lower rung exhausts its punch, each stage buys only enough time for the next until durable asset-based transfers become unavoidable. The first step is monetary. Fed cuts rates to zero and launches quantitative easing, but the boost fades quickly. It's certainly not sustainable to do that for a long time. Next up is fiscal. One-off stimulus checks revive demand once or twice before losing potency. You end up with problems like who's going to fund it, inflation, that sort of thing. And then structural, permanent asset-based income. There we go. Sorry, I'm stuttering a lot today. Dividends, UBI anchors long-run stability when cash tools stall. So this is basically how we would anticipate it to go to play out in the future. Each rung's limits force escalation upwards, turning short fixes into broader reforms. Pain equals willpower, or pain transitions into willpower. History shows that as economic strain deepens, Congress reliably climbs the ladder towards lasting programs. So the starter UBI jolt. This is kind of the number that I've settled on. A modest $300 monthly check to every U.S. adult delivers a macro-sized shot of demand while the deeper dividend ramps up. The math is simple yet powerful enough to smooth spending shocks without replacing wages. We've got 250 million adults in America. Universal reach keeps the administration friction near zero. We've already proven that we can do that with the stimulus checks. $300 per adult, small enough for bipartisan to swallow, large enough to matter. $300 a month would make a really big difference in a lot of people. Now, I've been thinking about this, and I actually think that we should probably start sooner with maybe a $50 a month UBI. And you might say, well, Dave, $50 a month doesn't pay rent, but you know what? That can ensure that your kids eat, right? Like, looking forward to that every month. It's like, hey, there's a nice little shot in the arm that'll help. So $75 billion a month, roughly $900 billion annually, or about 3% of current GDP. That's not huge, right? I mean, that is a big price tag, but that's not the biggest thing in the world, particularly for here in America. But then cash hits wallets fast, nudging aggregate consumption upward, funded by automation taxes, which is a haircut off the top for corporations. Now, one of the things that people have talked about is inflation as a big risk. What you need to realize, though, is that massive job loss is deflationary. Automation and technology is deflationary. So in fact, in order to maintain inflation, we might actually need UBI to jack up inflation rates. Now that's going to sound really crazy to some people, and we haven't modeled this yet, but we do know from past experience that technology is deflationary. We also know that job loss is deflationary. Is if people have less money, then they spend less and prices go down because demand goes down. So I ultimately suspect that because the current market orthodoxy from the Federal Reserve is that they're trying to control inflation rates above all else, they'll say, hey, if we start to tip into a deflationary economy, they're going to panic and say, what do we do? We can't lower interest rates any further. I mean, I guess you could put it negative, but it's like, well, instead of doing that, what if we just inject the money directly into people's wallets? So this is a bridge, not an endpoint. Wages will still dominate income today. The starter UBI steadies the economy until structural dividends scale. It's also a way to launch a test bed. That's kind of one of the reasons why I would recommend starting so low. All right, so next up is bootstrapping those local funds. Counties and states can seed future dividends before Congress acts by converting untapped corporate equity and public assets into perpetual income streams. Two simple mechanisms to turn idle wealth into citizen stakes without new debt. This is one of the biggest things is, okay, if you're gonna bootstrap all this with more debt, that's not necessarily sustainable. So, share grant tax credit. Firms get a 15% state tax. These are just proposals, by the way. Firms get a 15% state credit for donating company stock to a county trust, aligning profit motives with local resilience. Basically, as long as the company is operating locally and invests locally by giving some of their shares, they get a tax break, incentivizing the behavior that you want to see. Dormant asset leasing. Licensed bandwidth, carbon sinks, or land value leases instead of selling outright, preserving upside for the community. One of the problems when you sell land, like state land, directly to developers, is the incentives for the developers are make as much money as fast as possible and then leave. Which that works somewhat, but if you want to actually capture those rents and distribute them to the people, then this is another opportunity. County dividend seeds, trust returns begin small per capita payouts, testing post-labor income at pilot scale. So basically, and by the way, there's counties and cities already doing royalty trusts and land trusts and those sorts of things. We're not reinventing the wheel here. All of these exist. Next is coalition building. Early beneficiaries, residents, and donor firms become vocal allies for broader structural reform. Again, this already exists. We're just trying to codify it and formalize it. And then you end up with a copy-paste template. Any locality with taxable firms or natural assets can stand up a fund, spreading the bridge model nationwide. This is why I keep recommending we start at the municipal level, cities and counties, because one, a lot of cities and counties are already doing this. A lot of states are already doing this, but once you figure out what works, then you can scale it up. Next is the timeline. So basically the 2025 to 2035 ramp up. The bridge unfolds in three sequence phases, each triggered by the dashboard gauges and paced to the AI automation curve. So the dashboard gauges are like the economic agency index and some of the other data that we're working on. Accelerating agentic AI by 2028, followed by humanoid robots a few years later, means early pilots must start soon. Basically, we have agents today, but they're basically kind of like the iPhone moment. So it's going to take a couple years for them to really ramp up, even as they get smarter and cheaper and better. Because basically they haven't hit product market fit yet. They exist, they work, but they're not good enough, and they're not cheap enough, and they're not reliable enough yet for wide scale adoption. So we're projecting that AI agents are really going to take off mainstream 2028. That could be entirely too conservative. I know that there's a lot of people saying, Dave, they're taking off next year. And I would not be surprised if they take off in a big way next year. Anyways, phase 1, 2025 to 2028. Launch county wealth fund pilots and enforce short week job share dampers to cushion initial displacement. I personally don't think that shortening work weeks and job sharing really solves the problem, because that means that people are competing over a smaller bucket of work. It's basically musical chairs for work, which that might be an emergency thing, but I think that companies would really dramatically resist this because of the HR overhead of having multiple employees. But I wanted to include it just because some people have suggested that as a possibility. Next is phase 2, 2029 to 2032, hybrid income era, shrinking wages, pair with a 300 to 600 dividend as unemployment and hours worked remain on alert or sinking. And then 2033 to 35, mature dividend tops 50% of median consumption, letting work become optional for basic needs. This is extremely aggressive, but it might need to be that aggressive. You might say, 2035 is a decade from now. Dave, it's all going to be over and done with a decade from now. And I'm certainly on board with those numbers. I think that the robotic ramp up is going to be closer to 2040 to 2050 before we end up with 1 billion robots. But at the same time, even if there are humans competing over less and less manual labor to do, you're still going to see wages collapse there, because if you end up with twice as many skilled laborers with the same amount of work, and they're competing for work from robots, they're still not going to be doing that well. Plus, AI agents are basically infinitely scalable. So there's going to be some checkpoint metrics that we can watch. So U3, I think that's underemployment. Or maybe that's just plain unemployment. Hours worked dropping year over year. Wage profit divergence persists. So basically, as we see more evidence that automation is taking over, TLDR. Let's see. Next is stakeholder game plan. So this is basically what do each of the main pillars do? So each quadrant, households, firms, banks, and government, those are kind of the 4 primary stakeholders of this table of the economy. Each brings a unique lever to fortify the post-labor bridge once cheap money and checks run dry. Aligning their incentives turns stopgap tools into self-reinforcing transition. First, households enroll in county wealth funds and advocate for trigger-based UBI to anchor political momentum. This is basically going to be automatic, even if people don't know about post-labor economics. The fact that jobs are drying up and wages are going down means that people are going to vote with their wallets or vote based on their wallets. Which is basically going to say, I'm predicting that the 2028 presidential election is primarily going to be about unemployment and AI, and the cultural and economic effects of that. So look for that as the main inflection point. Next is firms. So firms is the economic term for companies and corporations. Donate equity for tax credits, pilot 4-day rotations, and pre-commit to dividend pay-ins from automation gains. Now, there are some people out there, one example is the windfall clause folks that are saying that we should ask companies to just voluntarily give up a lot of their gains. I don't think that's going to happen. However, if we create tax policies and other incentives that mean that they actually benefit from those qualified ownership donations that we've been talking about, then there's not really necessarily a reason that they won't, other than perhaps skepticism. But at the same time, if you give companies an option to avoid taxes by donating dividend-paying shares, why not? Next is banks. Banks, and so this is the big commercial banks, but it's also your local credit union. Underwrite dividend-backed consumer credit and package wealth fund shares as low-risk assets for institutional buyers. Basically, your bank becomes a touch point for a lot of these products, and it can also become completely automatic too. Next is government. Legislate the trigger dashboard, authorize tax incentive share grants, and mandate pace matching hour caps when alerts fire. These are all hypothetical ideas of basically implementing a series of triage stopgap measures, but ultimately the government will help with implementing UBI and greasing the wheels for all of these other things, allowing banks and firms and households to participate in a post-labor economic paradigm. So the final income portfolio, the post-labor household draws from a balance of three sources: modest remaining wages, dominant property dividends, and a steady transfer floor. Let's see. Next is diversifying dividend rails across banks. Local funds and federal schemes spreads risk and invites individual choice. This is one of the primary things. Individual choice must be maintained for the sake of, number one, economic agency. If you're entirely dependent on what the government says you can and cannot buy, that is authoritarianism. That is communism, plain and simple. That's not what we're aiming for. So residual wages, 20%, and this number didn't come from nowhere. 20% residual wages is based on looking at the mix of jobs and current income that seems like it's probably robust against automation. It could be wrong. It could be lower than that. But this is also going to be aggregate. So some people are still going to make plenty of money from wages. Some people are going to make zero. Attention economy, high liability, and license roles persist, but most routine blue, white, and pink collar jobs fade. Property income, 60%. Trust, fund, share-based dividends supply the bulk of everyday spending power. Government transfers, traditional safety net programs continue with only minor expansion, keeping a universal floor. So this is basically rolling unemployment insurance, Social Security, and UBI all into one is kind of the idea there. Now, when you look at some nations like Germany has government transfers closer to 30%, 25 to 30%. So we might drift up to about that. And then maybe you split the difference between residual wages and property income, depending on. Now, obviously, here in America, we're pretty phobic of government transfers. So people are going to want to try and keep it around where it is at today. Sorry, that's not the end. Failure modes to avoid. This is the last slide. Even the best built bridge can crack if politics, markets, or timing go sideways. These 5 risk channels explain how the transition could stall or even reverse, and why each must be monitored from day one. Number 1 is rapid automation surge. AI and robotics may scale faster than adaptation pathways, leaving households with no income gap to fill in the time. So this is kind of one of the things that a lot of people are worried about. I think that Hofstadter's law will apply here. And what I mean by that is that even though AI is capable of dislocating far more jobs today, simply just the lag time of implementation and the skepticism of businesses and the skepticism of governments and everything else, that's going to be the slowest, the slowest bottleneck. Next is elite wealth capture. This is something that a lot of people are really worried about out there in the comments. Regulatory or corporate pushback could corral new rents at the top, starving dividends even as consumer demand collapses. Now, I'll go back to the pyramid and we can talk through this one at a time to show where, by dividing it into that pyramid, you can actually prevent elite wealth capture at each level. Next is policy paralysis. Government inaction or status quo clinging, often driven by partisan gridlock, can freeze trigger responses and strand workers. However, again, historically speaking, it looks like that once unemployment gets powerful enough, Congress shuts up and acts. Not necessarily always in the best, but that's when gridlock and log jams break. Slow boil complacency. Gradual invisible displacement lulls society into believing the market will adjust, repeating 2 decades of wage stagnation. By the way, as I'm doing research for these books, it's not just 2 decades of wage stagnation, it's actually been 7 decades of automation eroding wages. I've got the receipts, and you'll see it in the book once it comes out. Next is demagogic backlash. Voter panic may empower leaders who promise to bring jobs back, derailing structural fixes with nostalgic but impossible pledges. So let's go through each of these in the pyramid one at a time, just as we wrap up, and talk about how structurally each one can be reinforced and avoid elite capture. So first and foremost, universal basic income, state and federal. As we saw with the stimulus checks, there was far less corruption there than there was in the paycheck. What was it? The PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program. So rather than signing up and paperwork and stuff, the government used IRS records and said, hey, you made X amount of money last year. We're going to give you a stimulus check based on that. Cool. Here you go. And so by cutting out a lot of middlemen and a lot of administrators, you can actually cut down on a lot of corruption with UBI. That's not something that has really come up in many of the studies. It's not like most of the studies that we've seen, they talk about the impacts on education and employment and investment and those sorts of things. What you really don't see is evidence of corruption or elite capture based on this. And the fact that everyone gets the same amount means that it's also harder to game the system. So universal basic income as the foundation at the state and federal level, pretty resilient. But again, you also don't want to be entirely dependent on the government. Next is public wealth fund dividends. So this is the endowments, the trusts, and those sorts of things. Again, there is some risk of accumulation, but this is mostly going to be government corruption is the primary risk here. And again, we're not reinventing the wheel. Plenty of nations, particularly in Europe, have national wealth funds. Several states have endowments and trusts and funds and those sorts of things. So we know how to govern those transparently and effectively while minimizing waste and corruption and elite capture. So then the next level is collectively owned private assets. So this is going to be stuff that is on the market, stuff like land and solar farms and DAOs and those sorts of things. Now, this is where elite capture is going to be still a risk factor. So, for instance, rental properties. BlackRock and other people are just buying up every rental property that they can get. So let's just use that as an example. One thing that you can do is that everyone from counties to states to federal governments can put caps on the amount of particularly single-family homes that can be owned by capital, by investments and VCs and foreign investors and those sorts of things. So that's just one example of, on a case-by-case basis, we can look at the asset class and say, what's the best way of actually regulating this asset class such that it avoids full elite capture. Next is personally accumulated assets. Basically, this will remain mostly unchanged. You can buy treasury, you can buy T-bills, you can buy stocks and bonds, you can buy rental properties. None of that really changes. But the biggest thing is, how do you as a little guy fight against the big dogs? And that's where collectively owned assets come together, is because rather than collective bargaining power, which is what labor unions created, now we're focusing on credit unions, which boost collective purchasing power, meaning that even if you are trying to compete with BlackRock and foreign Chinese investors and those sorts of things, you can pool your money to pull some of those resources back into American hands. And then of course, finally, residual wages. So anyways, I hope this all helps clear up the overall plan for post-labor economics. Thank you everyone for watching all the way to the very end, and all the feedback. It's also very helpful when I see where people are getting it, where they're confused, and those sorts of things. So with all that being said, thanks for watching all 5 episodes of the Post-Labor Economic Lecture Series. I will see you next time. Cheers.